Background. Okay, there we go. Hey, how's it going?
Hey, well,
Uh, Nice to finally speak to you.
you too. I'm super excited for it.
No problem whatsoever, man.
So, I mean, he didn't do very well. He didn't really challenge you on any factual grounds. It seemed like he had his usual points that he hits people on. But because you were knowledgeable in the subject matter, you were able to call him out on a few things.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, when you called him out, it didn't really do anything for the conversation because he would just immediately move past it.
So you think he was like basically like dialogue treeing me?
He was trying to, but the hiccups in his dialogue tree weren't nearly as detrimental to his arguments as I had hoped that they would be. So, like when he was making a comparison, I think, to preface this, normally I take all of the shorthand notes that I have for a conversation and make them into like formal talking points, but I haven't done that for this, so I'm kind of just reading like gibberish on my piece of paper.
Oh, that's
But
fine.
if I recall correctly, he made a comparison about a bombing that had happened or a missile attack. And he said that there was no dead at one of these attacks and that it was suspicious that there was nobody that was killed. And then you were like, well, there was 100 people that were wounded, but okay.
Yeah,
But
yeah, because the IRGC and basically it was after the Soleimani killing, right? And everybody was on
mhm,
edge because we knew that Iran was going to respond, but we didn't really know how. And the main reason, and this isn't talked about, the reason why the Soleimani killing was so disastrous, number one, we killed Soleimani, which is a high profile figure, but number two
mm,
is because we did it directly. We didn't use like a proxy because a lot of times we have plausible deniability if we use like one of like our like militias that we support in the region to like carry out an attack, right? And we can basically
mhm,
and in response they can just go tit for tat and attack that militia. But since we did it directly, there was a high probability of them attacking us. Well, there was a certain amount of probability that they attacked us directly because if you go tit to tat with someone who just attacked you directly, your option is to attack them back directly, and that's what was
mm.
so scary. And so what they ended up doing was doing a missile strike on a American airbase that injured over 100 American soldiers, which was the instance he was talking about. But instead, he said instead he just said the words they did a strike, but it killed nobody.
Mm. Which was kind of like dismissive of what actually had happened.
Yeah, basically.
And then there's the Kurds are Kurds.
Yeah.
These like these are things that normally if anybody's listening to this conversation for like who they think is most correct or knowledgeable, they will be persuaded by you. But I just worry that in that conversation in particular, the people who are already on his team and listening to what he's saying may not have been completely. But it helped that you were like really kind in trying to find common ground with them too, where you're like, well, no, I agree. Like so and so is bad and this is bad. I just think that like we could do this instead of that and probably get more benefit out of it. Or,
Mm-hmm.
we can have our cake and eat it too by doing this and this.
I even tried to like find opportunities to praise Trump's foreign policy, which for me is pretty
Mm,
difficult because I have not only do I take a completely different worldview from Trump, which I still don't even understand his foreign policy worldview exactly, but for instance, I had to go all the way to like his policy with Taiwan to like give him some praise. Like, hey, him sending weapons to Taiwan was a good thing considering their like consistent pressure from the CCP. But like,
mm.
I felt like that was kind of just like whatever. You're just criticizing Trump to criticize Trump.
Yeah. And again, when you would say things that are so far outside of what people are talking about, which is part of why I love listening to you, because you've done a lot of research into things and it gives you a very unique perspective on how things have happened. And you stay on top of your understanding of things. And if somebody's going to challenge it, you need to know why. And so sometimes the way you respond to things he's saying or other streamers are saying comes from that place of education on the background of all these events. And it can seem like your responses come out of left field, like, oh, I didn't even know that this was the case. Or like when you
Hmm.
were talking about Kurds or Kurds, honestly, I mean, like, I didn't know anything about
About
that.
like how like Trump's like he very obviously didn't understand like the relationship the Kurds had or like what like really who the Kurds were or anything about it. And so I feel like that's why he had to do that response because originally if you actually like the clip which is cut out from the famous clip, and now the
Mm.
notification for my channel is the before he thought I said that statement, as in if I was asserting that like all the Kurds are endomorphs, blah, and he said no, that's what his actions and words have asserted. And when I
Mm.
turned it around and said that thing you just called stupid wasn't me saying that stuff, that was the president. That's when the Kurds are Kurds statement had, because not only was it the fact that like he didn't know how to respond to it, but he also previously called that statement dumb when he didn't know the president said it.
Yeah. And he gets lost in this because again, I don't think he's coming at it from a place of like, oh, I understand all this stuff at some level, and so I'm going to use my current understanding to expand that. If like he has talking points and a plan for like common places the conversation goes and how to counter them, and then if he counters somebody and they like keep battling him on it, he eventually just pivots and lets it go. Hey, I'm not saying he's perfect, but blah blah blah. And then he's
Mm-hmm.
all done with it. Um, and it was just funny when you would give him a response that's very specific and he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have a specific response back. Like it's so far outside the realm of his dialogue tree that he can't formulate a response to it without risking not being correct.
What interested me, right? I need a good stuff in the background. I'm gonna be running a military march. What interested me
Hmm.
was like anytime I would bring up like something that like Trump did or like something with Trump is the constant kind of like shift to like Obama or this other thing or this thing that was like not really that related. Or
Yeah.
if it was related, when I tried to expand on it, we'd shift back like immediately. Like I remember like we were
Hmm.
talking about we talked about the nuclear deal for like half a second, and when he made the criticism of it allowed them to like I basically the criticism I've seen him make a lot of times is it allowed them to still make nuclear weapons if like after 10 years and like it wasn't stringent enough in UN inspectors. Now me like having like gone through the Iran deal, I know that that's probably the weakest thing you could criticize the Iran deal for. I mean, like the ex-head of the Mossad, which is the like basically the Israeli CIA, actually basically was
Hmm.
like, no, this is extremely stringent deal, and like that's somebody
Hmm.
who literally was the head of the Israeli intelligence agency, basically. And so the best thing you could criticize the deal, and I even tried to shift it to that, was the idea that um when you criticize the Iran deal, your best criticism could be that this deal does nothing to deal with the proxy conflicts we continue to engage in with Iran, whether it be within
Hmm.
Iraq, whether it be within Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, the Yemeni conflict, and I think that would be the most substantive criticism of the Iran deal.
Like that kind of touches on what I think might be an effective strategy in the future for people like that. So if we assume that he's coming from a place of like a dialogue tree or like a very biased understanding of these events, I think we've found that if you take him outside of that context, he's not able to operate. So I wonder if it would be funny to give him hypothetical situations that are tied to these specific conflicts just without the name. So like, well, let's assume we had a leader of this country and he did X, Y, and Z and that the history is this. Like, how would you actually deal with that? Or like what would your approach be? Would you do this? Would you do that? And then letting him choose without all those buzzwords to actually understand what's going on. And if he asks questions like, oh, well, that sounds like this, then obviously he's educated in it. But I don't think he would take that route. And if you can force him to make his own decisions about things that are more in line with like a logical approach, which will not, align with all the policy decisions that this dude has made, I wonder if that would force him into places where he'd have to agree with you because he gave you a conclusion before he knew the context of what that meant for his argument.
That's actually a really good idea, and I hadn't actually thought of that before. Because I feel like if I went through like the paces of like, hey, so we had a long-standing ally that we had an ally that we worked with, and we supplied them to fight a terrorist organization, and one of our other allies was very basically wanted to crack down on this on our ally, but we, being allies with both, was able to create a balance using the force of using a very small amount of soldiers of about 50 to 150 to stop them from hurting each other. This assisted our strategic interests in hurting one of the most powerful terrorist organizations in the world and eventually destroying their territorial holdings. This also
Mm.
allowed us to put ourselves in a strategic position with that ally against our strategic rivals and other countries. Should we pull out those troops and allow our ally to crack down on them? I think most people would be like, well, no, obviously not. We can't just backstab our ally. And then I'd be like, okay, that's what Trump did to the Kurds.
Yeah. And if he had more context for like an educated opinion about it and he sees the obvious parallels between the given like, quote unquote hypothetical example and the actual example that he has opinions about, then he could easily jump in and be like, you're referring to this conflict and the extra context that made me come to a different conclusion is this, this, and this part of that foreign affair. But I doubt he's going to come up with that. But I imagine that if somebody did have an educated take, that's where they would pull it, and then you would go from there. But yeah, it forces him to think outside of the context of what he's heard. Because when you use the names of different leaders and countries and stuff like that, you give him the scaffolding to insert other talking points and things that may not even be related to what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Like I feel like this dialogue tree about well, the Iranian people hated Soleimani. It was a weird conversation because like I've never read anything to that extent, like that the Iranian people on like mass hated Soleimani, and I felt like if I talked about it in any other context of hey, a foreign nation that is not engaged in a war assassinates or kills the one of the biggest political figures within a nation,
Mm-hmm.
and out of what many would say, which was a massive escalation according to many, and just kills one of their top generals, or if I plugged in a separate country to that, and then said, how do you
Mm-hmm.
think the public's going to react to that? The majority of the time, I think he would probably say, well, they're probably going to be pretty angry.
A
But
Kurd is
because
a Kurd.
Soleimani was the name, he was like, well, no, he's the evil terrorist, so they hate him, right? Even though that's not really how the Iranian perspective views him. And hey, Andrew, thanks for the $2. I really appreciate it. Hey, do
Oh.
you know about Ryan Dawson? Um, I
I
believe.
do not.
No, sorry, no, that was the question he asked me with the two
Oh,
bucks. I do not know who that is, but I'm also bad with names. Isn't that like the
uh,
YouTuber? Anyway, yeah, continue. Sorry.
Ryan Dawson. Oh, yeah, huh? The guy that does conspiracy stuff.
Possibly. Let me check.
Or no, that's Shane Dawson.
Yeah, I
Maybe
was
that's his
thinking that.
brother.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking about. Dawson. Let me see. Ryan Dawson is um
A
Ryan Dawson.
Nazi.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, never mind. Yep, it looks. Oh boy. On Killstream. Yep, that's enough for me. Yeah.
Oh, but he has a lot of takes on the Middle East, Andrew says.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
I have a weird feeling I'm probably gonna disagree with him about Mearsheimer.
Oh, here's one thing I feel like I might disagree with you on, but I'm completely ignorant as to things in the Middle East. So there's this idea that depending on how we treat our allies or people that we want to engage in a deal with in the Middle East, if we do something like bomb them in a neutral airport or things like this, that we can shake the possibility of future conversations with
Mm-hmm.
these organizations or groups. And I wonder if it almost feels to me like what I want to consider maybe like first world countries or first world governments and the way we engage politically with them and in conversations with them feels very different from with the terrorists. And I wonder if it's okay to take these rash and drastic actions with the terrorists if we have the opportunity, because I see a lot of parallels in like the way we handled conflict in the Cold War, but I don't know enough about history to know if those actually harmed us for a really long time
By
or if they were kind of
like striking somewhere in an area you're not supposed to strike or stuff of that sort.
and the way we handled the Korean War. Like I had just learned about all this and I saw what felt like a lot of parallels with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the way that we're kind of handling like terrorists now in negotiations with them and being awful. And I kind of wonder if it's just known that like if you're not exactly an ally of the US, you're on shaky grounds making negotiating with them.
My thing is, right, if I am going to eliminate the possibility of negotiation, I want to make sure that I'm not going to need to negotiate. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if I'm going to do something that would be viewed as so offensive to the whatever geopolitical rival we have that they will not negotiate with us on this, I would have to be so utterly devastating or destructive or be so strategic and like well executed that we put them in a position where they would have to submit or would be unable to even like stand up past that point. You get what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah, that's how I would view something of that. I think that cutting off diplomatic channels for extremely small marginal gains, or just to get that one little extra nudge, isn't something I would want to practice in, because it closes off so many more avenues in the future, many of which we probably don't even see at this point.
Mm. How do you factor in like unseen favors and back channels when trying to understand history or foreign policy?
Could you expand on that question?
Yeah. So again, I just got on like a crazy binge reading about the Cold War. And I learned that there was a lot more going on, for instance, between JFK and the Russian leader at the time, or the Soviet leader. I'm forgetting his name. It was a K name, maybe? The guy before
Khrushchev.
Khrushchev, yeah. In that there were like letters and communications between them that kind of, it was almost like it was at a different frequency than what was being shown in the public. And I wonder about how you try to understand surface level events like the killing of Soleimani versus like maybe that was a favor for some country, and like how do you personally as like a foreign policy advisor try to take into account that these may be favors or these may be parts of like bigger negotiations?
I think you need to sometimes, like, when you see like it's hard because you obviously aren't getting the full picture as somebody who's not within an administration, right?
Mm.
If I am, for instance, just like a civilian, and I hear like America pulls out of, for instance, Panama or whatever country, where America has decided to like send weapons to this group or aid to this country, and it's kind of out of the blue, or then it's well, okay, I'll just stay on that and then I'll move to the second point. Then it's kind of
Yeah.
like, that's kind of weird, that's kind of random, and you gotta kind of look at like, okay, what has been going on recently that this would be related to, right? So let's say that
Mm.
we were in a long, like, let's say that me and Iran, or like say Pakistan and India were escalating tensions over Kashmir or whatever region, right?
Hmm.
And then randomly you heard Pakistan pulls back troops from this region of India. Then you could look at the larger context and say that's probably part of some negotiation tactic or some offer that was made or some deal that was made with the Indian government. And then later you might see that India does something as well, and then you'd be like, okay, that it looks like something's forming, right?
Yes.
That would be the way you would try to look at it, like see how this would apply to certain situations in the world, right? So
Hmm.
an example would be if, let's say, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we started to see that America was saying, which I believe, I'm not a huge like, I don't know too much about the Cuban Missile Crisis, to be completely fair, but
Okay.
I believe what ended up happening is they decided to pull nuclear weapons out of Turkey, right?
That was the weird part of it, was that was actually the part that blew me away, is about the weapons in Turkey.
Yeah, most people
So
don't know about that.
and it's so funky because like JFK had already planned to be taking those out, but now if he did that publicly after it
Hmm.
was asked of him, then it would look weak, and like all these different dimensions to it. And then the communications with the
Want to
Soviet
know
rep,
something interesting?
through that. Yeah.
Because of what weapon systems Turkey is using now, they can actually not deploy our nuclear weapons if they wanted to.
Hmm.
Which basically means, and I read this a while ago, so I might be a little bit off, but I think I'm right here. Which basically means that the nuclear weapons that are within Turkey right now could not be used. And so, what they've become is an extremely explosive friendship bracelet. That it's kind of like a line, because we have a very tense relationship with Turkey sometimes. It's basically a line that people are like, hey, we're not going to cross this line of taking this away, no matter how like bad a relationship gets, to always remind each other we're allies at the end of the day. So it's basically like
Hmm.
a very, very fucking explosive and deadly world-ending friendship bracelet at this point.
Oh, it's so strange that like one of the things that I listened to try to better understand this after reading about it was hardcore history. He did like a big thing on the that missile crisis and everything.
Hmm.
Um, and just the perspective that he took was how did nuclear weapons influence that entire period. So if we just look at it from the perspective of how did nuclear weapons change the way we looked at war and diplomacy, it's crazy to think about how everything at the surface level was really incorrect. So like we had a bunch of bombs, but we had no ways of delivering them because we just had conventional aircraft. So we had to put a bunch of money into strategic aircraft. And even when the USSR had weapons, they didn't really have delivery systems, and the delivery systems that they did have were way less, capable than they were making it out to be. And thinking about every single nuke and power around the world as like cards in your hand and how you're going to play those, and that the next president you have to pass all those cards to, and they have to quickly figure out the state of the whole board of world politics and play that game.
That's,
And it made me really concerned about modern politics.
there's something that scares me about democracy quite a lot when it comes to foreign affairs, and it's the fact that two parties could have such different views of how we're supposed to approach foreign policy that that changes in party can completely upend American foreign policy in an instant. And the Iran deal is a perfect example of that. Where even if we were to get Biden in office, what the message has been sent is that deals just are only basically in place, could only be in place basically until the next election, and that all you need to do is wait 4 years and an agreement with America could be completely thrown out the window. That has been shown with the Kurds, that has been shown with the Iran deal, and it's something that's very scary with me, that the Democrats and the Republicans have such a different, or at least Trump and the Democrats have so different views on how we're supposed to approach foreign policy that basically routine elections could uproot American foreign policy every 4 years and be a big shock to our strategic interests.
I I almost look at it, maybe this is pessimistic or cynical, and again, I don't have the background in this, but I almost look at it as a big advertisement for meddling in the US elections. Because I feel like what this signals to other nations is in order to make sure that your deals stay in power, you can't just ignore the political things that are going on in the United States, in that if other actors are going to take active roles that are going to undo treaties or deals or this or that, it's almost like, well, then you need to start playing at the level that like Russia or other actors are playing at, and you need to start meddling in the elections. And it's very well possible to manipulate the American public into putting somebody in who's got different views from even the existing political parties, and that all
Yeah.
you have to do is make sure that person gets into power.
Oh yeah, I mean it's scary, or just stop a certain person from getting into power, right?
Yes.
I mean, from like a Russian perspective, the idea of getting Trump in there was a lot more beneficial than getting the idea of getting Hillary Clinton in there. Somebody who wanted to like develop no-fly zones in Syria, somebody who was a lot more strong on the Ukraine issue. Even though Trump did eventually end up sending weapons to Ukraine. Um, but there was also like a certain different type of dialogue around Russia, around Trump, than there was Hillary Clinton. And so it would make very obvious sense why they would want Trump in there instead of Hillary Clinton. And Putin was very blunt about this in interviews too, basically like, yeah, Trump's dialogue has been like a lot better, basically, and we want to cooperate and stuff like that, and stuff of that sort, which doesn't sound nefarious, but it's weird when in election season you have like a foreign leader making those kind of comments about an election, and
Although, didn't they do the same thing, if I recall? Again, I read this maybe 2 days ago, so maybe it's just fresh on my mind. But I think that the USSR acted the same way when JFK was elected. Like they felt like, oh, this is going to be good for us. Yay, we got this guy in here.
yeah, I mean, yeah, this is the thing where I would assume this would also be true in like any a government that's completely run off of technocracy or anything else, where they can have a consistent foreign policy and they could see elections as opportunities to change the course of their geopolitical rivals' foreign policy. And that's the thing that kind of scares me about democracy, is the idea that our foreign policy, even if we were to get back on track, for how long until we're set back off track, right? Because if it becomes a policy of the Trumpist foreign policy becomes the norm in the Republican Party, then that means like every 4 years we could have another foreign policy like Trump's. Now I would say that that's kind of unlikely considering the fact that the Republican Party has actually universally condemned him in a lot of his operations. Like, for instance, when he pulled out of northeastern Syria, he was pretty much universally condemned by the Republican Party, and that I would say most Republicans are most definitely more knowledgeable than Trump is when it comes to foreign policy. But it's the worrying idea that that strain of thought could completely infect deep into the party, like many of his other ideas have.
A Kurd is a Kurd.
One thing I've been thinking about is about how we've kept Mexico poor, essentially.
Thanks
and
for the
that
$1.90. Appreciate it.
It seems like it would be trivial almost to just start investing in and putting time into fixing Mexico. I'm wondering, what are the benefits to keeping Mexico poor if they're not a manufacturing hub or like super beneficial to us, it would seem, trade-wise, compared to somewhere like China?
I'm not an expert in South American policy, but what I can say is that there are a lot of benefits, in my opinion, to not keeping them poor. But I would say that the idea is for a lot of manufacturers, right? Which I don't. Which again, I don't know how Mexico's like labor policies are, so I can't comment. But if you have cheap labor, basically get a huge influx of investment, you can raise GDP like extremely, and that would be the benefit of immediate extreme economic growth, right?
Yes. I mean, I just look at China, I guess, and I look at how intelligent it seems that they are in like business operations within third world countries and other places. And I don't understand how the United States isn't doing similar stuff with buying debt and doing all these investments in other countries and building infrastructure.
We just don't do it to the same extent. Like, for instance, we actually do invest in Africa. We're probably the second, I think, like the second biggest investor besides China. We just don't do it to the same extent.
Okay.
And that's what my thing I would comment. I would say that we should invest more in this. I would say that, for instance, I'm a big I really want us to use our time a lot better. And what I mean by that is our commander-in-chief is one person, and he only has so much time to like contribute like through his day. Right? He has 24 hours, and of course he has to sleep and do other things. And so I think that the amount of time we're concentrating in military conflicts in the Middle East could be detrimental to our reach around the rest of the globe. Because we've had to put so much political capital there when we should maybe be concentrating a little bit more on the Scarborough Shoal, South China Sea, and resolving conflicts in Latin America.
How do you balance that with how important and economically beneficial our military presence is compared to China, with like having bases and covert ops and relationships with the militaries of all the countries that we're involved in conflicts with?
I mean, China's not nearly like near our level when it comes to the amount of money we throw into the military. They are getting closer in tech, but still it's a good another 20-30 years till they get like to our level in that. We have a ton of aircraft carriers. I think they are working on or have finished one. They have, I think, around 5 military bases. We have hundreds around the world. I mean, we're leaps and bounds ahead of them, and of course that has economic benefits due to the fact that we're a arms manufacturer. Therefore, we have a lot of jobs that do come from the military industrial complex. And then, of course, there's the fact that a lot of nations in the world rely on our military equipment for their strategic, defense. And so that gives us a lot of leverage, so it allows us to like export a lot of weapons and stuff of that sort. My question would be, though, could we invest that? When it comes to our military, there's a few things I want to change up. I think we need to put more money into research and development in the short term when it comes to how we're going to decrease our costs. And I think that, for instance, like I think like less personnel intensive operations should be the future. Less personnel on the ground and less personnel in general. And that investing in technology that can concentrate on that would be lovely. Definitely, since like subsidies is like a huge drain. on military spending and other sorts. And of course, like, military deployments are not cheap. And of course, I always believe that we should put more money into diplomacy, which would allow us not to have to resort to the hammer as often, which would then not only give us more time to devote those military resources to other regions where they might be needed, but would mean that we could just, like, generally concentrate on other regions more, because getting in the war room takes a lot of time.
I think the personnel aspect is like kind of probably like a big point of having the big military spending, because they're meant to employ a bunch of people and give them skills and all that. So I don't know if we'd ever move towards like removing personnel and stuff. It feels like
I
that's
actually
a big
have
part of it.
I have a good link I could actually give you.
Sure.
Let me see if I can find it. I think I put it in somebody else's chat. See if I can.
And if I ever say anything like hella incorrect, let me know, because I'm super interested in this stuff, but I really
No
don't know a ton
problem.
about it.
So this is something from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and what this goes into is basically it talks about our perspective when it comes to military. I'm gonna put it in the general in my Twitch chat. It talks basically about different approaches we're considering that a lot of theorists like try to take for the future of American military, and if you'll notice a trend of reducing cost. And one of those ways to reduce cost that has been pretty consistent between a lot of these theories is investment in R&D for the idea of reducing costs in the long run from, like, personnel and equipment costs. 1 second. Let me see if I can actually read this on stream. And then after this, I think I might have to head out because I got to take a economics test before midnight. Okay, let me read this quick. Yeah, so this has a... 1 second, should have the brief here somewhere. Let me see. Getting to less. The minimal exposure strategy, the progressive value strategy, the innovative superiority strategy, and exploring the press for less in defense commitments. There we go. Okay. Okay. Let me see if I can find one. Okay, here's the innovative defense approach, right? Let me see if this is the one I was thinking about. The innovative defense approach is especially popular with many defense thinkers. It maintains relatively robust national security objectives, but seeks to significantly shift the ways and ultimately reduce the cost of the U.S. military contributions to those objectives. The goal includes protecting the U.S. homeland, ensuring that a democratic form of government continues to flourish in the United States, and facilitating a peaceful world abroad, which further secures the United States and contributes to increased American prosperity. In securing its objectives, this approach relies significantly on technological innovation to create a more effective force at a lower cost. One variant of an innovative defense strategy was delineated. By the way, the one I take is called a progressive defense approach, which we'll talk about that quickly, and then I probably got to end stream. Was delineated at length by John Hill and Lawrence Norb during the 2000 presidential election, and informed the views of incoming Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Its key elements are described below. In lieu of antiquated and lumbering militaries of the Cold War, innovative defense thinkers promote precision, range, speed, and stealth. This is an emphasis on using space-based systems that not only support ground, sea, and air forces with better intelligence, communications, navigation, and weather forecasting, but are capable of firepower anywhere else in the world on a moment's notice. This approach seeks to use increasingly mobile communication systems to enable speed and maneuverability. The goal is to cripple an adversary's command and control while simultaneously protecting that of the United States. In the air, the United States should rely increasingly on stealth technologies and continue to develop unmanned technologies. Unmanned drones, for example, would be one of the first things I'd point to, an area where we would reduce the amount of people we would employ because we would not need as many people, flying fighter jets into battle, right? With greater reliance on technology and speed, this approach modifies the U.S. Air Force structure. First, strategic... blah, blah, blah. Let me actually get to the thing that... Okay. The Marines will rely on smaller sea-based forces that emphasize standoff weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles. The Air Force will become a space and air force. Aircraft of the future will be stealthier, have more lethal weapons and longer ranges, and increasingly become unmanned. The U.S. Navy will begin to shift away from carrier-based force to one that provides the same sort of mobile sea power through craft, such as arsenal ship, stealth battleship, and distributed capital ship. Basically, what have echoed the seems to do. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. Then and now, proponents generally argue for new upfront investments to realize operational and technological gains, yet they also foresee such investments reaping a payoff that allows for a reduction in defense expenditures over time. One contemporary proponent presents the fiscal argument in this way. In the sense, it's not just about protecting the security money for defense innovation. A focus on technological innovation can also be linked to cost savings. Indeed, as a result of retirement packages, housing allowances, and health care, almost a quarter of the U.S. defense budget is allocated to military personnel costs, and the Congressional Budget Office estimates that there are 46% increase in military personnel costs between 2000 and 2014 alone. Apart from cutting expensive personnel, reducing benefit costs, and relying on civilian contractors for services, one other way of reducing military personnel costs is to replace them where possible with high-tech solutions, such as robotics in factories and unmanned aerial vehicles on the battlefield. Do you get what I was trying to get at a little bit more?
Yeah, so I understood it back then. I think my only response to it would be that I think the personnel component is like a huge part of the spending, for a reason, because I think that the benefits it provides whoever's allocating those funds, usually if it's the Republicans who want to expand it, is that all of those people are going to kind of vote the way that you want. It gives you like a stable base of employment, and then it's benefiting all those companies.
The thing that hey, it benefits the companies, number one. Two, it employs people. So, but then you could make that argument for just about any career that has gone the wayside. Hey, we should continue to subsidize coal because it employs people. Even though it might not be the most effective way of getting energy, we need to continue to hire caboose men for trains because they need a job.
Maybe I should mention that uniquely with the military and its objectives, I think that we're at a point where I don't know if I would personally be comfortable spending a ton more money in innovation when we're at the point where it's I agree that any innovation is probably going to go in the unmanned direction. And I think a lot of that's going to be pushed by private enterprise because they're equally invested in unmanned technology and AI and all that. And I think that we probably don't need to develop more complex weapon systems as much as we do the hiring of the people part of it. Just because maybe I'm incorrect on that.
Drone technology in recent years, every single presidency you hear basically the same story. More use of drones. Every single presidency. And there's increases in it. And, for instance, under Trump, we saw a 300% increase of drone technology. A large part of that is the fact that he's, he doesn't care about as tight rules of engagement as President Obama did. But also another part of that is the fact that drone technology continues to develop and become more efficient. And because of that, they're being used more and more and more. And
it's a presidential I guess I look at drones uniquely as a power of the president. It's almost like a way that the president can enact and step above Congress to do whatever they want to do. And I guess that's why I look at that and go, well, that'll develop naturally in the private. And I don't know if we want to put a bunch of money into that as much as we do getting healthcare to these people and getting all those associated personnel costs that'll probably help us get other policies passed as that balloons up.
Well, my thing is I would rather take that money that would be put on healthcare costs for the military personnel and invest that domestically in productive capital so we could get healthcare costs down for all people, all Americans.
Yes.
I'm a big Medicare for all guy, for example, right? I actually supported Bernie Sanders in the primary, which a lot of people in the foreign policy community don't find that kind of strange, but I always found he has shown that he is willing to use force, whether it be in the Bosnian or Kosovo conflict or in the fact that he voted for the Afghanistan war. Even though I sometimes don't agree with that when it comes to Kuwait, for example. And has also shown an ability to show extensive restraint Definitely when it comes to his want to, for example, defund our funding of the slaughter in Yemen. He voted against the Iraq War, which I also opposed. I would say his Afghanistan War vote was a bad vote, in my opinion. I agree with Barbara Lee's criticisms of the Afghanistan War that our objectives were not narrow enough, and therefore once we got in there, our goals expanded, and we got bogged down.
Mm. Because if he had a moral compass and is willing to listen to intelligent people, I'm sure that he could figure out whatever he currently doesn't understand about it. I guess we're in a better position with that than someone who understands all that but doesn't.
The only thing I'm worried about with Bernie is that I worried that when it came to conflicts like the South China Sea, he would not necessarily always be ready to like show strong, like a strong amount of strength where it's needed, if you get what I'm saying. Like being able to say like, they right now are building artificial islands and are threatening Taiwanese sovereignty. We need to do a freedom of navigation operation immediately. Like I'd rather, because I know like that is a long-term goal. Yeah, it's a lot about posturing. Somebody in the chat just made it, and I don't know if he's willing to do that type of posturing that is needed. Like, for instance, sending weapons to Taiwan. Like, I don't know if he'd be willing to do that. Free trade agreements with Taiwan, which is actually extremely important for geopolitical reasons, due to the fact that the Taiwanese economy is deeply tied to the Chinese economy. And so if China wanted to, hold that over them, they could. And so they want to have, like, other, like, financial cushions they could fall down upon if that scenario was to play out. And I don't know if he'd be willing to, like... I mean, Obama, for example, kind of didn't respond strong enough to the Scarborough Shoal being basically just claimed by China when there was Filipino territory, enough for me. So I just don't know if he would have been strong enough in that region comparative to anybody, all the rest of the Democratic candidates.
That would be worrisome. I don't know if this could be briefly answered, but how did Ukraine happen? How is it that Russia can invade a country and take a part of its land and get away with it like that? I didn't understand when that happened how it was happening.
Well, according to Putin, there's no Russians in Ukraine. I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, there are Russians. They just chose to be Russian now and not Ukrainian.
No, man. Look,
they've embraced themselves.
Yeah,
their true identity.
It's a tough issue when you look at Ukraine. And again, European conflicts are not my thing, so this is not something I know too much about. But I'll tell you what I do know is that the Russian capture of Ukraine is extremely complicated due to the fact that, number one, what they did was highly illegal under international law. You don't just fucking take land. Their very obvious military support for rebels in the Donbass region is also extremely problematic in the perpetuation of that conflict. But there's also the fact that the people in Crimea generally seem to also want to be Russian. So that's the problem, where you have the fact that Crimeans look like, generally, on the whole, not on the whole, but a large majority of them want to be within the Russian state. All polling I've seen suggests that. Of course, the vote they had suggested that, but I don't really hold that to any regard. But from everything I've read, it seems that is the case, that the Crimeans do generally want to be in Russia. But this isn't how land transfers are supposed to work.
Yeah.
This is not how you gain territory. You don't just invade another country like that and just say, this is ours now.
But did Ukraine have no allies to call upon?
The problem was that they were looking at, and I think this is why Putin moved so quickly, they were looking at joining NATO. And they were going to be joining NATO probably very shortly. And that's why partially why the reason Putin moved when he did, because he wanted to use the small window he had available to him. And there was also and it was made even easier by the fact that there's a lot of political unrest within Ukraine as a whole. There was like a revolution against a corrupt Russian-loved government, and like all this other stuff. Recently, they had a comedian elected to office. A comedian who, by the way, played a president in a TV series, which makes it just not much funny. It'd be like if, what was his name? He was the guy who's disgraced now, and he was in House of Cards.
Oh, the Frank Underwood guy, Kevin
Yeah,
Spacey.
if Kevin Spacey somehow actually became president. And to be fair, though, with all the sexual assault allegations swimming around our our Democratic options at the moment, for the Republican and Democratic Party, I wouldn't be surprised if Kevin Spacey made a run for it.
It's a man I trust the posture. Okay, so that explains Ukraine. All right. Dang. How do you go about explaining these conflicts to people without going into like millions of years of history and cultural, lenses through which to view everything? It seems like you have a uniquely difficult job.
It is extremely difficult, right? Because some days, like when I'm debating foreign policy, I'll get I remember I debated election and I had 130 viewers. Like, that's good numbers. For our conversation, I've had about 18 to 24. And that's not because I don't value this conversation. I value this conversation highly. But when you need to make foreign policy flashy and interesting to people. I have a devoted fan base of people who really, really, really into foreign policy. And I really appreciate them. But I need to somehow find... I feel like recently... recently it's gone on a little uptick because of the content I've been pushing out. But that I need to find a way to sell it. To really sell it to people that, hey, foreign policy isn't the yawner thing that this is really interesting. There's war, there's conflict, and this is something that affects your pocketbook at the end of the day in ways you don't understand.
I would look at historians to do that because this hardcore history guy, I kid you not, I've binged now maybe 30, almost 40 hours of his stuff just because I like this perspective approach that he takes, because it's my approach to conversation and rhetoric in general, is that we need to understand everything from the human perspective. And he goes into that for every individual leader and every like cultural group. So he's like, imagine that you were born, in feudal Japan, and these are the restrictions that are placed on you, and these are your beliefs, and these are your cultural values. He's like, and you get, headbound into that kind of way of thinking. He's like, it limits the actual decisions that you can make, because right now you're trying to think as an American in the 21st century and you're making decisions based on that. He's like, but all of that confines once you put everything in a perspective like that.
I think that, for instance, that has been helpful when I explain Iran, for example, right? Like when I was talking to, I even think that was probably one of the most productive parts of the conversation I had with Lecture Fan, was the fact at one point I remember him saying like, I was like, what's your end goal? Well, the overthrow of the regime and the institution of like a Western friendly government. And I'm like, okay, the problem is when we look at this, right? Actually, the best example I think was when I talked about like how the Solemani strike affected our relationship with Iraq. He said, well, if they were already about to be terrorists, right, then what's the problem? They're just terrorists. And I explained, well, if you're an Iraqi citizen who's seen that your government overthrown, invaded by a foreign country, occupied for the majority of your life, if you're a younger Iraqi, I mean, you don't know a nation beforehand. Maybe you were like 5 years old, and this is all you know. And then recently, you saw that members of the Iraqi military were killed by an airstrike by a foreign occupier, members of an Iraqi military that fought off ISIS. Also, this airstrike was done without the Iraqi government's permission and was, on top of everything else, a violation of sovereignty. And then when your government votes to expel U.S. forces from Iraq in a non-binding resolution, they just basically say no.
Yeah.
Like how do you think that's gonna react? No matter how moderate you are, it's gonna be hard to view that positively. And that was when he like really like I felt him like take a step back for a second, which was good.
Well, conservatives in general, this is kind of why this is what I'm suggesting to people just generally is this perspective thing. Because I think the common man who's interested in understanding the intellectual or logical part of it, which you offer because you know all the background and the history and you're educated and willing to walk people through that. That's one group of people. Then there's the other group who are very attuned to their emotions, a sense of what they believe is right or traditional or culturally acceptable. And for those people, you lose them in the discussion of intelligent points or of logic and all that stuff. And you have to connect that back to their human experience, or they don't listen to it. They're detached from it. And so I think you get both groups of people when you try to put them in the shoes of those who have come before or of those who are currently in these issues. And when you paint a picture not only of the context for things, but the restrictions on things is super helpful, because I think, again, the people on the right like that they can have their opinions restricted to the point where it's like, oh, if I say these certain things or appeal to these certain principles, I will win no matter what with my people, because my people are simple and they have simple traditional
Yeah.
principles.
I felt like in my discussion with Lecture Fan, it was simply like I would just wanted to be soft on Iran and nice to terrorists, and that was my foreign policy stance, and that's what I felt like he perceived my foreign policy stance to be.
That's what he said, but I don't think that was really the picture that was painted.
What
Because
would
he
you
says
say?
that, but I mean, I would say that you were you just didn't come off strong. And so I think that's why that could get away with some other people. Like, you didn't come off as super sure of yourself on points, or with like a prescription that will solve all the problems. And I think a lot of the time that's what conservatives look for. So if you don't bring to the table a simple an easy to understand solution that solves everything, they can view you as weak. But I don't think that was the reality of what happened. I think
Yeah.
the reality is that
That's
you like,
actually was my criticism of the analysis of the Iran deal many conservatives give, that they want basically that none of this addresses all the other proxy conflicts in the Middle East. And I'm like, okay, so
right.
your Iran deal, you want to solve the nuclear problem. You want UN inspectors to go have 24-hour access to basically everything. On top of that, you want to deal with the issue within Iraq, the issue within southern Lebanon and Hezbollah, the issue with the conflict in Yemen, the influence in other regions of the world, and sanctions, everything. You want all the issues in the Middle East to be solved within one piece of international cooperation. That's
I
a
mean,
fairy tale.
for a lot of them, all these groups that you're talking about making that you're distinguishing between, I don't think that's how other people view it. I think a lot of people view it as like, this is a amorphous group called the Middle East, which has all these tribal conflicts that we don't really care about, and it's
That's
just
always how
basically
they've been, but yeah.
yeah, there's like the Muslim states, and then there's the terrorists. And I think that's the only distinctions that we really make, is we have these Muslim states that are always fighting and are like engaged in tribal whatever, and then we have the terrorists who uniquely target the United States above and beyond what their governments do. And I think that's kind of the conservative viewpoint. And if you're not making all those you're not looking at it super complicated. They just want things that at a bigger level they can see increases or decreases our power or spending, and that's good enough for them. They don't really care about the particulars, which is
Okay.
unfortunate.
Yeah, I feel like that was the case. Is there any other points on the paper you wanted to go over for the lecture fan discussion?
No, like I said, you did super well. It's just how do you deal with somebody who's coming in bad faith? And I think it's to know the flavor of bad faith that they're coming in with, and how you're going to navigate that in a wholesome way that's going to appeal to their audience, not necessarily them.
Do you
Because he made his
do you
mind
think
up.
I did that well?
I think you could do it better next time, but yes, I think to the people who are listening for facts and logic, they're going to probably go for you, just because you presented like counters to things that nobody else has for him, and that's why I wanted to see you talk to him.
Yeah. I remember what was really interesting was the discussion about the person who took over after Soleimani. And like, because it's a thing that literally nobody talks about. Nobody even like know who he. Most people don't even know who he is, right? I mean, most people didn't even know who Soleimani was. So how are you gonna know who his second in command was, right?
Right.
So I felt like bringing that up, and like the fact that this guy has extensive experience here. He worked under him for 2 decades, also fought in the Iran-Iraq war, organized militias from Afghanistan to go to Syria, from Pakistan to go to Syria. I mean, he has shown capabilities to operate in Asia. I mean, this is somebody who has made strong statements. I mean, I even like tried to quote like an expert who said that even experts agree with me that the fact that this guy got killed probably isn't going to reduce the capabilities of the Quds force, and they got increased funding. And he just said said, and then eventually he said, but I was told like Soleimani was the special guy who couldn't be replaced, which wasn't like him arguing with me, but it was like something he was like told once.
Yeah. So like one thing I tell my audience sometimes is often when you're arguing with somebody, if you're arguing with that other person and you're pretending like they came up with these beliefs, you're doing an uphill battle. A lot of the time if you just ask them where they heard it and you attack or argue with that source, or you frame the entire conversation as a discussion you're having with that source and that opinion separate from the person, you have a lot greater chance of changing their opinion because they've been removed from the equation. Someone else has to take the fall if that opinion is incorrect, and you're simply somebody that helped them instead of telling them they're wrong.
Okay. I really appreciate this discussion. I gotta head out. It's about to be 10 p.m., so I got 2 hours to take a test. I really
Not a
appreciate
problem.
you taking some time to come on stream, and I'm starting a new series called Foreign Policy Novice. It's FP Novice.
Ooh.
And what it's basically, the whole point of it is to bring on people who know very little about foreign policy and to just have them ask me questions about whatever comes to mind. And the point of it is that I never really, as somebody who's like studies this a lot, I don't always like think of questions that I wouldn't think of usually. Like, for instance, if someone's just like, hey Dylan, what's the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia? I'm like, oh shit, well I just like I always assumed that as a given because that I've like known about it for so long. I've actually never explained that. Let me go into detail with it. And so if
Oh
you
my gosh. This is actually something I talk with I stream about a lot. Tutors and teachers reach out to me, and it's this crossing the expert novice gap, and how am I as an expert able to take the perspective of somebody who's new to this? And yeah, it's just asking questions like that. That's awesome. Yeah, if you ever want to do that, I would love to do that. Just ask you a bunch of questions.
yeah, that's the idea. I've got like 10 separate people who want to do it, so I'm really happy. I'm actually doing it tomorrow with Bela. Who's going to be coming on to talk about, I think she wants to talk about Taiwan. So that's going to be really interesting.
Awesome. I'll stay tuned.
Awesome. And yeah, just DM me and I'll figure out a date when you can come on and we can do that. Okay?
Sounds good. Have a good one.
You have a good one too.